Morning. It is March 25th, 2022, and we're going to continue with part 2 of Exclusion and Embrace's Introduction by Miroslav Volf. There'll probably be a third section, and we'll see if I can get to that later today, but no promises. In the previous section, he sort of established some historical background to the rise of nationalism as opposed to globalization. And he is going to be proposing a third way, a Christian way, in between these two options. So as you'll find, he's not necessarily going to side with any of these two perspectives on all things that they're going to espouse. But in the last section, I closed with a section on religion, how religions oftentimes become tools of identitarian conflict, and when they ought to be separate factors on their own. So he points out the importance of religion being politically engaged, but not becoming a political religion. The difference between one where religion has its own identity, the second where it is merely a tool of the state. So to continue, the European New Right, Generation Identitaire in France, Identitaire Belgium in Germany and Austria, Generation Identity in Great Britain, is the most influential political identity movement in the West over the past 2 decades or so. It is also philosophically among the most sophisticated. Like their Russian counterparts, and unlike most of their American ones, the representatives of the European New Right reject not just the purported decadence and emptiness in Western culture, but also capitalism and the primacy of instrumental reason, which are believed to underpin that decadence and emptiness. But the chief enemy of these identitarians, and that's the term he's going to be using for nationalism as a whole, identitarians, people for whom identity is more important than community or humanity. Identitarians is not the dominant Western culture. It is not even non-white immigrants who, in the identitarian telling, threaten to undo Europe. The chief enemy is the cosmopolitan, multicultural, and liberal globalists. It is they who have opened Europe's gates wide to what French writer and polemicist Renaud Camus calls counter-globalization, the Great Deculturalization, or the Great Replacement, 3 terms for the idea that Middle Easterners, North Africans, and Sub-Saharan Africans, most of them Muslim and all of them non-white, are gradually replacing Europe's white majority, the carriers of Christian, or at least Christianly shaped, civilization. The chief enemy of the European New Right are the globalists, but the chief value is the integrity of European ethnoculture. Most European identitarians are Christians, often young, conservative Catholics. Even some secular identitarians think of themselves as Christian atheists, insisting on the Christian character of the secular West. This reminds me of a movie that happened in the 1950s. Again, I wasn't alive, but I've read about it, of the Death of God movement, wherein there was a secularization of religious themes and theology, insisting on the Christian character of the secular West. Their motto is, Europe will either be Christian or it will cease to be. But when it comes to the content of their social vision, the Christian faith that the European identitarians, along with their counterparts in America and Russia, claim for themselves, has been hollowed out to a sacralized marker of identity and a tool in political struggles. The 2 central pillars of the identitarian movement will fall if placed on a foundation that is substantively Christian. The first pillar of the identitarian movement is the primacy of ethno-cultural identity. I'll repeat that again. The first pillar of identitarian movement is the primacy of ethno-cultural identity. The idea that your ethno-cultural identity is a real category as opposed to a social construct. First comes the mother's lap, the father's house, the village, the area, the country, the nation, the state. Last is mankind. So these are sort of categories for deciding what is priority when it comes to identity. Firstly, the mother's lap, so your family, then your father's house, so the space of your family's property, the village, so your immediate community, the area, and then the country, the nation state, and finally mankind. This is according to Carol Summerfield, a leading philosopher of the New Right. Some such progression is the moral development of an individual is likely true. But for Summerfield, the order of expansion of moral sensibility is also the order of anthropological and moral primacy among the widening circles of identity. We do identify with mankind as God's children, she writes, but we do it in a way that we can fit this identity into the range of the circles of identity. A person's identity as God's image and God's child is fitted into other identities and not the other way around. We are primarily members of our native community, home, geographic region, and so on, and only secondarily members of the diverse human community, or the church, the one people of God that speaks many languages. And so we can see in this, it's a clear reversal of the priority of our religious identity. And it's a clear reversal of the idea that religion should be able to define its own boundaries. It turns religion into a tool that fits within the framework that these authors, in this case, Summerfield, has for it. And you notice that she's following along sort of a natural progression of moral awareness. So we first, as we are growing up in developmental psychology, become aware of our own mother, and then eventually we recognize the existence of our father and the space that exists in there. And then we become ethically aware of and responsible to our village, and then the area, and then the country, and the nation and state. And then finally we develop an awareness of the importance of our connection to mankind. And that's the progression of psychological development. Christianity would say we are all God's children, and so our identity is ultimately grounded in that. And that in practice, it plays out in these smaller spheres and these smaller circles. But Summerfield wants to reverse that and say the order of natural psychological progression is also the order in which things should be prioritized. So that's the first pillar of identitarian movement, the primacy of ethno-cultural identity. The first pillar of identitarianism, the primacy of native identity, is decisive, but it demands the second and supporting pillar, without which the edifice of identitarianism would collapse. That second pillar is the legitimacy of violence and protection of group identity. And this is where you're going to see the justifications for what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now. Because it's not couched in traditional Christian ethics or traditional just war theory, as it is usually. But it's couched in this concept of identity, this threat of NATO and the Western culture to the identity and the unique culture that Russia represents. That second pillar is the legitimacy of violence and the protection of group identity. This is not a version of the just war justification of violence, whose progenitor is the North African church father Augustine. This is a sovereignty of identity justification of violence, whose advocate is the mid-20th century Russian thinker Ivan Ilyin. The just war theory in its best version is a defense of the lives of people rather than of the cultural identity that it is a concrete application of the love of enemy. And it is a concrete application of the love of enemy. In all its versions, it rests on what are deemed to be universal moral commitments, binding on both friend and foe. The sovereignty of group identity justification of violence is a theory of resistance to evil in outright rejection, not just of the love of enemy, but of the community transcending universal claims of justice as well. The demand for the survival of the group's threatened identity suffices to, quote-unquote, justify even those violent actions, like war, which Ilyin believed to be always sinful. My prayer is like a sword, and my sword is like a prayer, he wrote, tying religion with sinful but necessary violence. And so we can see that the justifications that come for Russia's invasion of Ukraine are not on the basis of actual military provocation or actual violent threats, but it is the cultural threat, the threat of the annihilation of their culture and the identity of the Russian people that is at risk. And if, as Putin claims, Ukraine is not really separate as a culture, then as it moves towards a Western mindset and it shifts its culture, that is seen as the death of a portion of this Russian culture, which would justify violence in the preservation of. The two pillars of identitarianism rest more firmly on the foundation of classical paganism than on the foundation of the Christian faith. Consider the primacy of native identity, the more important of the two pillars. Alain de Benoit, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the most distinguished philosopher of the identitarian movement and a self-confessed pagan, writes, "Pagan thought, which is fundamentally attached to roots and to the place as the preferred center around which identity can crystallize, can only reject all religions and philosophical forms of universalism. Universalism, by contrast, finds its basis in Judeo-Christian monotheism." And by universalism, he's not talking about theological universalism, and he's not necessarily talking about globalism either. But he is talking about the idea that if there is one God, he is the God of all people. And therefore, that religion should be a universal religion, something that's relevant and important for all people. And that's what he means by universalism. And that's something that this pagan author recognizes comes uniquely from Judeo-Christian and Islamic monotheism. You don't get that from paganism. And so he sees fundamentally using religion, particularly these monotheistic religions, as identitarian markers is fundamentally non-Christian. It is instead rooted in pagan thought, which is rooted in the identity of geography and cultural roots. One God is by definition the God of all humans, and the relation of that one God to all persons is the foundation of their common humanity, rendering, in de Beauvoir's interpretation, the particularity and uniqueness of each insignificant. So his danger, this author's fear for universalist religions is that it supposedly oppresses or it limits the uniqueness of individuals. But in Genesis 1, the notion of the image of God expresses just such a difference-denying relation between God and humans. He believes it grounds equality and common humanity of all, but forces each to abolish his own history. In contrast to this account of the consequences of monotheism in line with his paganism, de Beauvoir insists on the primacy of particular histories. Goethe is universal by first being German. Cervantes is universal by being primarily Spanish. What all human beings have in common is secondary to what distinguishes them from each other. What is primary for each are shared biological roots, shared language, shared customs, shared territory, in a phrase, shared social identity. So the debate is between, do we ground our identity as humans and our identity fundamentally in our relation to God, the one true God, which would make us all in some sense equal, all in sense part of the same human race? Or do we ground it in the particularities of language, customs, territory, and biological roots? The most widely quoted New Testament verse, John 3:16, states that God loved the world with self-sacrificial love so that through Christ all may have true life. John 1:7. De Beauvoir wants many gods of diverse ethno-cultural groups to return and replace that one God and the ideology of the same, at whose origins that God stands and whose current form is the regime of rights and the monotheism of the market. But if de Beauvoir gets his way and the renaissance of the gods takes place, it won't bring freedom from the totalitarianism of the same, but the terror of unreconciled differences. One might argue that, in a sense, the gods had returned during the war in former Yugoslavia, reconfigured on the pattern of ethnic monotheism, and that the gods are returning now in many parts of the world. This is why I wrote Exclusion and Embrace, and this is why it continues to be relevant today. So as we can see, from Miroslav Volf's perspective as a pastor and as a theologian, identitarian conflicts are fundamentally theological ones. They are rooted in conflicts over the identity of God and gods. If there are actually different gods or different concepts that fulfill the function of gods, then they are at conflict. Think the ancient Greek gods or the Norse gods that were always fighting amongst themselves, tricking each other, trying to get the upper hand over each other. There was no fundamental unity between them. And if that's the case, then we are forever going to be at odds. Our identities are constantly going to be clashing. If, on the other hand, there is one true God, if, on the other hand, there is a God who all of our identities are rooted in, and who is fundamentally the source of all being and purpose, and created all the world by himself, then we have a basis for unity. We have a basis for recognizing common humanity and for pursuing peace in this world. And so that is why Miroslav Volf, as a theologian, sees this as a fundamentally theological problem that he, as a theologian, is then responsible to address and try to reconcile. So as we continue, there'll be one more part, but I probably won't get to it today, so I'll talk to you another day.